Well, today we are looking at the conclusion of chapter 9 in Spong's book. I just thought I'd stop and see if there were any, before I get started on my tear, as I usually go on here. Are there any comments or questions or insights that people have had while reading this? This is a real treat for me because there are just so many new insights on every page, really. Um, any thoughts or questions you all have?
Dan,
Yeah, Denny.
on page 90, chapter 9, I believe, Spong has a wonderful comment in there about to be born of water.
Right. That's where we're picking up today. Exactly.
And I couldn't help but thinking, because we just bought Hannah Nicole Jones 1619, and she has a new children's book out, sort of, Born on the Water. But the comments about halfway through that third paragraph, Jesus identifies the Spirit with the mystery of the wind, which could have been taken right out of Marilyn Robinson's novel on Lila, which is a wonderful, wonderful comment, on the mystical, almost mystical forces, of wind and water.
Right.
That we virtually never think about.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the elements, earth, wind, fire, and water were so foundational to Greek thought and to early alchemical thinking and things along those lines. But we've kind of moved so far away from that. But this is actually where you are is exactly where we were going to start. Talking about Nicodemus and this whole idea of being born again naturally, the way we think of it now in the 20th and 21st century among evangelical circles. It involves a complete conversion, that usually is accompanied by some sort of fundamentalist reading of scripture and understanding of yourself as of living an entirely new life apart from that of the old. But this is not what Spong seems to be. This is not what Spong is suggesting. That seems to be the intent of John in this gospel. And then the story is of Nicodemus, of course, who is a Pharisee, who symbolically, all of this we're reading this story symbolically, right? It's just rich with metaphorical meaning, which is one thing that Spong simply wants to, cannot emphasize enough, that all of these stories, they are types, they are archetypes, you might say. They're symbols of events that are happening historically at the time, of course, in the first century, but also happen within the human psyche as well. Here's Nicodemus who comes to Jesus at night, and this is why I use this Lafarge image here, because the darkness is just overwhelming, and the light for Nicodemus is in his scripture. He's got the scroll laid out on his on his lap there, and that's what he abides by. That's what he holds so fast to. He's interested in what Jesus has to say. He must intuitively sense that Jesus has a teaching that is true. But when Jesus asks him to go to take a step that is beyond what Nicodemus is willing to do, there's disappointment in this. The darkness remains. Nicodemus has to hold fast to his very structured thinking of who God is, God who has to be somehow validated by the authorities of the day. They have to be validated by the teachings of the synagogue. So Nicodemus represents the old, kind of staid opinion of how to reach God by following God's law and being as morally upright according to that law as possible. Now that doesn't get thrown out by Jesus, but it's just a surface understanding that Jesus wants to dig down and say, hey, there's a much more primal event that's happening in your life and in the life of the world, in the lives of other people, that all of that fundamentalism, let's just call it that, all of that very, very staid understanding of religion is keeping you from understanding. You will never know the light. The darkness is going to be that of which you are, going to continually surround you. And that's where Jesus says, this idea of you must be born of water and spirit. And that's where I was going to start reading on page 90, actually. I think it's a little bit after where you just were. So let me just read where you were. Unless one is born of water and the spirit, he or she cannot enter the realm of God. Remember, the realm of God here is the word that's being replaced for the kingdom of God. I mean, the kingdom of God is being replaced by the realm of God. The kingdom suggests something external, it suggests something political, and is seen throughout the New Testament. I should say it's seen throughout the Gospels on the mouth of Jesus and the words of Jesus. But the realm of God is one that is both internal and external as well. But the realm of God is accessed internally first. And we're going to develop that a little bit later today. Water, being born of water in this phrase is not a secret reference to baptism, which according to traditional church teaching is to be undergone at or near one's birth in order to commit the child to the Christ path. Nor is spirit a secret reference to that of the conversion process when a decision is made to accept Jesus. So what has happened, and we've fallen victim to this, is that in the hundreds of years that ensue after the writing of this gospel, because of church teaching, we have come to think that Jesus is referring here to baptism. You have to be baptized by water, and then you have to be baptized by the Holy Spirit, as we see in Paul, for example, being baptized by both of those things. But here's the really interesting thing, and look how elemental this is, Denny. This comes back to what you're talking about. To be born of water is simply to be born into this life of this world, a process achieved in the breaking of the maternal waters. To be born of spirit is to step into the new dimension of what it means to be human. John makes that abundantly clear in the next sentence when he has Jesus say, that which is born of flesh is flesh, and that which is born of spirit is spirit. Then Jesus identifies the spirit with the mystery of the wind that blows where it will. To be born of the spirit is the same kind of mysterious, mystical experience. So, we all share one birth, being born of the water, according to this reading, right? When the maternal waters are broken, which, none of us can remember this experience, but how incredibly overwhelming that must be to move from being a water being, really, for 9 months of your life into this new world of breathing air. That's pretty traumatic as it is. Well, we all share that birth, but few of us, and fewer by the time of Jesus, know that there's another birth that's possible, and that is the birth of the spirit. We kind of callous ourselves and set up rules and restrictions and regulations that keep us safe and keep us within certain bounds, so that our freedom doesn't have to be exercised too rigorously. And as a result, we come to get lazy living that way. and never fully understand that there is a deeper life that is possible for us. And that's that life in the spirit, recognition of the presence of God in me and in all things. And this is what Nicodemus is unable to do. And Nicodemus here, not a man so much as the Jews who, by the time that the Gospel of John is being written, are probably very vehemently opposing the Johannine community and their understanding of Jesus and his, his messiahship. So, interested, but not willing to take the final step. Any thoughts on that? Sharon, do you?
Dan, I was wondering about the water part, because I've been using the HarperCollins dictionary or Bible with all the footnotes as we've gone through here to see what they're doing with that concept of water and baptism.
Yeah.
And that was an automatic baptism interpretation for HarperCollins.
Of course.
And so I thought I might ask, is there another word for water that might indicate a different kind of water as opposed to, like birth water, as opposed to the water of the stream?
No, no, it's, I guess, hudra. Darn it, I don't have my Greek. I could get my Greek New Testament. It's right in the next room. But I don't think so. I think it's a pretty basic word that is being used. It's not like this is a symbolic word that's being used. But your point is a good one, and that is, even the people who are writing the HarperCollins Bible and the footnotes have been kind of lulled into this very doctrinaire understanding that Spong is trying to challenge, right? When we read this, you have to be baptized, and you also have to be, receive the Spirit. And what Spong is saying here is that in the Johannine community, those things happen apart from the structure of, can happen apart from the structure of the church, which is pretty radical, right? That's not what you want to hear if you're going to try to, bring a whole European continent under the control of the church. But this is what Spong is saying. This is how radical Jesus is. Was it Mac? Mac, did you have something, or somebody else wanted to say something on this? Thank you for that, Sharon. Okay. Well, I always love to be reminded of this, but there is a story in Numbers, and John is going to make this connection with Jesus as the healing serpent. Remember, we're talking about this Merkabah mysticism, this enthronement mysticism, where all of these visions of the past of God being enthroned, whether it's with Isaiah or whether it's with Ezekiel or whether it's with, Enoch and some of the apocalyptic writers, this sense of God's glory being surrounded by angels on a throne, this was not an uncommon movement in the time of Jesus among Jews. It wasn't the dominant movement, but it was not an uncommon movement, at least according to Spong. And throughout the Gospel of John, we're going to see that these book of signs that the Gospel of John is based on are breadcrumbs, you might say. Jesus will perform certain acts that are breadcrumbs that lead us to this realization of his enthronement, not on a throne of gold but on a wooden cross. But there are prefigurations of this. And one of those is this idea of the lifting up of the bronze serpent in Numbers. you might remember the story. And this is a story that was written after the Babylonian captivity. It's a priestly tradition where Moses is with the people in the desert, and they're complaining, as always. They wish they could return to the flesh pots of Egypt. And why did you bring us out here? And this God is not looking out after us. And then God, according to Numbers, let me read it. Let me just read it here for you. I did mark it this time. Numbers 21, 4-9. From Mount Hor, they set out by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. But the people became impatient on the way. The people spoke against Moses and against God. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we detest this miserable food. This being the, I guess by this time, this would be the manna. The Lord sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people so that many of the Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, we've sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord to take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, make a poisonous serpent and set it on a pole. And everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live. So Moses made a serpent of bronze and put it on a pole. And whenever a serpent bit someone, that person would look at the serpent of bronze and live. John, according to Spong, is making this reference to Jesus as the healing serpent. Let me try to find the reference here. So John sees Jesus symbolically as a serpent lifted up on the cross. Well, it's on page 92, and I've got the quote on the next slide here. But I don't think very many people are aware, at least I forget this from time to time, but when we see the symbol of the medical community of a staff with, I think it's 2 serpents actually on the staff, that is a reference to this healing art of the serpent on the cross, or this bronze serpent lifted up by Moses. This was the serpent that protected people from the poisonous serpents, right? John is saying, and John is giving us a prefiguration of Jesus being lifted up on the cross in much the same way that the bronze serpent was lifted up on the pole to heal the people of Israel in their, in their stiff-neckedness, in their turning against God, in their sin, I say. So I just wanted to quote Spong on this as we finish up chapter 9. This is on page 92. John is referring here once more to the throne of mysticism. This reference is to this exaltation, this glorification that is going to come at the end of the gospel, when Jesus is going to be lifted up, but not in the way that all the previous visions have suggested. Yes, it's going to be on a throne, but it's going to be on a very, very humble and meek, and the throne of execution, the throne of the cross. At the climax of his gospel, Jesus will be enthroned not on a throne of gold, reflecting earthly power, or even on a throne of bronze, as was the serpent, but on a throne of wood fashioned into a cross, an instrument of execution through which he will reflect a new humanity. That will be the doorway into a new consciousness. Now, that's an important point, that somehow this crucifixion of Christ on the cross will open it. It's a key that will open the doorway into a new consciousness, a new oneness with all that God is, a doorway into that which is eternal. The God Jesus reveals is the source of love that comes not to judge human inadequacy. And this is really an important point. The God that Jesus reveals is a source of love that comes not to judge human inadequacy, but to open the eyes of people to see that they are part of who and what God is, so that they can enter the eternity that God represents. And here's the sentence that is very, very difficult for especially those of us in the Reformed or the Calvinist tradition, because it suggests something of our participation in our own salvation, right? Judgment, says the Johannine Christ, is not a divine act, but a human choice. It means, like Nicodemus, to prefer the darkness to the light, to choose security over freedom, to relate to what is and never to see what can be. We judge ourselves when we choose darkness over light, as Nicodemus did. We make a judgment against ourselves when we choose the security of doctrine, of staid tradition, of all of those things that were representative of the synagogue at the time. We choose judgment. We judge ourselves when we choose security over freedom. And we judge ourselves when we choose to relate to what is the church, the synagogue, and never to see what can be. This new dimension, this new consciousness, this new understanding of the world where God is available to all. And that concludes chapter 9. So any thoughts on this idea? Because this comes down to what we might call Arminianism in the early doctrines of the church, where it's not by the grace of God that we are saved, but by God's grace alone. And this is we see this, of course, in the Protestant Reformation as well, saved by grace through faith, as Paul says. But Spong is saying something different here. We have a choice to open the door to this new dimension. And that's kind of heretical. The fact that it is heretical, according to doctrines. Mac, you want to say something?
I think you might have basically just answered the question, because I recall we were talking about this earlier, and Spong mentioned that he thought part of John was a tip of the hat to Paul,
Right.
without naming him. And I believe he said that, they weren't alike because they had such differences on the concept of salvation.
Right.
And my question was going to be, is this essentially the crux of that difference? And
Absolutely.
I think you made it pretty clear it is.
Yeah, very much so. Very much that is the crux of it. But John is, when we're talking about that, we were talking about Nathaniel, I believe, and Nathaniel as a kind of a prototype or a archetype of Paul. But Paul did introduce something into the Christian tradition, if we can call it that by that time. Paul introduced this idea of being able to experience the presence of Christ in a very, very immediate way, not through doctrine, but by a vision. Paul had this vision. He was taken up into a third heaven. But then Paul's conclusion on this was that, that is only available to people who receive the Spirit, and people who receive the Spirit do so by no means of their own. It's a gift given of God. And John here is saying, oh no, God is the creator of all. The Spirit of God is present in all things and thus available to all. And it's a matter of whether you want to choose to take a leap of faith. And this is Kierkegaard, actually, in so many ways. If you want to take a leap of faith and live in a rather precarious way in a world that is not, where you're not tethered to laws and rules and everything, because God is mysterious, God is infinite, God is overwhelming, and God is not safe. this consciousness of God is not going to be a safe consciousness. It's one in which the world is overwhelming. The multifariousness of the world, it is just almost too much for human beings. So we like to put blinkers on, blinders that keep our world manageable. And we do that with our religious doctrines, and we do that with the law and all the way that the synagogue Jews did. Don't think that this is going to be, that story of Aslan in C.S. Lewis, right? When Lucy and Susan are asking, is he a dangerous lion? and I think the answer is, well, I can't remember who said this. Oh, yes, he's quite dangerous, but also one who is approachable. It's like this feral cat that I just brought into my house because of I've been feeding this cat. He's deaf. He's got 6 toes on each of his hands. He's and he's huge. He must be 20 pounds, a pure muscle, right? But he's just a loving, but man, any minute that cat could swipe at me and cut my arms open, Well, I think that's what we're talking about here too. This is the God that you cannot look into, cannot see face to face, but it is a God that you can't approach. So anyway, that's a long little diatribe there, I guess. I didn't really need to go into. Any other comments about this?
Dan,
Yeah, go ahead, Denny.
as an aside, did the gospel writers have access to the letters of Paul?
Luke may have. The gospel writers in John, there seems to have been some knowledge of Paul, but we don't see anywhere in the gospel where Paul is directly quoted. But we know that Luke was a companion of Paul, so he certainly knew Paul's theology, but I don't think he used his letters. Luke did not use Paul's letters to write his gospel, or at least we don't see any textual evidence of that. So yeah, that's a real mystery there too, because Paul was certainly working with different people and working with different assumptions as a Gentile, apostle. So I want to see where our time is here. Well, I want to introduce also, we're going to move in now into another story of the Samaritan woman at the well. And something I've been thinking about in all of this with my study of mysticism historically, in the past, is something that Spong is intimating, at least, and that is that this knowledge of God is available to all through God, through creation, as well as through a very, very firsthand mystical experience, where one becomes part of God consciousness, you might say. One's consciousness is brought into an awareness of the presence of God within and without. And mystics have used this language quite a bit, but the ones who've used it most successfully have been the female mystics like Julian of Norwich and Hildegard of Bingen. These were people writing in the 12th through the 14th century. And they were able to talk about this mystical union with God in very highly sexual terms. Now that really rubs us the wrong way, no pun intended, in terms of, because, our Puritan culture does not allow us to think of anything having to do with, sexuality and our spirituality. But John is alluding to this, and Spong is alluding to this in his reflections on John, and it has to do with this theme of the bridegroom, We've already seen in chapter 2 where Jesus is introduced as the bridegroom at the wedding feast, whose time has not yet come. We think that we try to read it literally, you know, like Jesus was at the wedding of a friend or somebody, and that guy was a bridegroom. No, all of this is symbolic. Jesus is the bridegroom, and the wedding is about to begin. The wedding is commencing, even though, you know, the water's been turned into wine. This gets the ball rolling towards the enthronement that is about to happen, where the true wedding feast will take place. But who is the bride? We are now going to be introduced to the symbolic bride in a story that we think we know very well, and that's the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. But back to this understanding of knowledge of God, mysticism is about knowing God in an intimate way. And this is a special a characteristic of the Hebrew language for the word, or for the Hebrew word for to know. And you might know this through, you know, kind of, you know, locker room jokes about, you know, knowing somebody in the biblical sense, but it's true. To know somebody is to become intimately connected with them. The two become one. And Adam knew his wife. He didn't, you know, just know her objectively, just like, oh, there's somebody that I can cognitively recognize. No, Adam became one with her through sexual union. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about mysticism, this kind of ecstatic union between a subject and the object of that subject's love, whether it's God with the individual or the individual with God, the two become one. And that has had heretical overtones in the past, because when you become one with God, well, logically, you become God, right? But this is a tradition that goes back, well, even before the Hebrew tradition, back to Hinduism. And the Upanishads, becoming one with the essence of all things. So Jesus is the bridegroom then in John, calling forth the bride to become one with him. God is the bridegroom calling forth creation to become one with God. But who can know God? Is it just, you know, in the past, the idea was just the Jews. They were the chosen people. They were the ones who had received the very intimate knowledge of God's name. God is I am. God's name is I am, or more literally, I will be whatever I will be. It's less of a static rendering of that term, Yahweh, Yod, He, Vav, He in Hebrew. I will be whatever I will be. It is the verb to be. God is a verb in the Hebrew tradition. And what we tend to do is we tend to reify that and make God a static noun, right? No, God is this verb, and this verb is seeking out to know that which has been created and vice versa, calling forth that which has been created to become one with God. But who gets called? Well, God didn't begin in the beginning to call the entire creation, right? God chose first a man, Abraham, and then a people, offspring of Abraham. And then as history progresses, it's through this people that the whole world comes to be called. Unfortunately, what happens in the history of the Hebrew people, the history of the Israelites, they tend to take their chosenness as a privilege instead of a responsibility. It is through them and through their living out the covenant that the nations of the world were supposed to be brought to God. But they saw that as a privilege, and they distinguished themselves as above the rest. And that this is what Jesus, according to John and according to Spong's reading of John, wants to remedy. It's not just the Jews who are called. And who better to be called and to represent this than those people that were utterly despised by the Jews? These people who were seen as the epitome of everything non-human, the epitome of everything that is against God. And those were the Samaritans. And in order to understand why the Samaritans were that way, Spong goes through a little history that I'll try to recount in a rather quickly, because I think some of us may know it, and it's rather complex. But before that, let's just remember the story, if we will. And I thought about reading it, but it's a good 60 verses long. But Jesus is going to Jerusalem on one of the several occasions he goes up to Jerusalem. And typically, if I can show you the map of over here on the right is the map of Palestine in Jesus' day. Jesus was from Nazareth in Galilee. And you can see here's Cana where the wedding feast was. Here's the Sea of Galilee. And of course, you got the Jordan River that descends all the way down into the Dead Sea, which is 1 mile below sea level. Now, if you were a Jew living in Galilee, and these were regions that were called tetrarchies in Jesus' time because they were ruled by certain Herodian kings. You had Galilee and Samaria, Judea, Decapolis, Idumea to the south, and Philistia, the Philistines. But let's just think about Galilee, Samaria, and Judea. Galilee is where Jesus lived, Sea of Galilee there. Judea is where the temple was in Jerusalem. So if you were a good Jew and you were going to go from Galilee to Judea, you would have to pass through Samaria. Well, the Samaritans at that time were so vile, according to the Jews, that most Jews went to what's called the Transjordan on the other side of the Jordan and walked all the way and crossed over into Jerusalem so they didn't have to pass through Samaria. That's how completely, I get reviled the Samaritans were. So this is the historical background of this, and I'll give you some reasons why that's the case. But there's something, and I had never thought about this, and this is why reading the Bible your whole life is so wonderful, because these new connections are made and just like, oh, that makes perfect sense. So anyway, when we're reading the story, what we tend to do is we think of Jesus and another woman, and we tend to think of the moral overtones that go along with this story. The woman at the well, ask anybody in church and they will tell you, oh yeah, well, she's coming to the well at daytime to gather water. And this is a famous well, Jacob's well. She's coming to the well at daytime to gather water. And she's the only one there because all the other women have gathered water early in the morning. Right? It doesn't say this in the text, but we've read this into it. Well, why is she coming late in the day? Well, because she's a woman of ill repute. She's had 5 husbands, right? So immediately we start reading the story of between the good Jesus and this bad, sexually promiscuous, adulterous woman. It has nothing to do with that, according to Spong. It has nothing to do with sexual morality. In the literal sense, maybe I should say. If you remember now, you're a Jew and you're reading the story in the Johannine community and you're picking up on certain markers. A well. Give me a drink, Jesus asks of the woman at the well. And, the conversation that takes place after that. Well, if you're a good Jew and you know anything about Jewish folklore, that you read about in Genesis, the folk tales in Genesis, you know that the well is a place where, at least in the Israelite tradition, the great fathers of the faith went to find their wife. Now that lends a whole new insight into the story. Jesus is finding, the bridegroom is finding his wife, is seeking out his wife. And the markers in the Jesus story match up so clearly with what we read in Genesis chapter 24 or Genesis chapter 29, or even the story of Moses and Zipporah. These are stories about, well, first of all, Isaac. In Genesis chapter 24, Abraham doesn't want his son Isaac to marry, these Canaanite women in the land where they're now living. So he sends him back to back home. And the story goes, he sends a servant back and he tells the servant, go to the place where the women are gathering water at the well and ask a woman for a drink. And if she gives you the drink, and she also waters your camel, then that's the woman who will marry Isaac. So the story is about, kind of this God-led trip that the servant makes. And lo and behold, this is how Isaac is brought together with his cousin, Rebecca. Rebecca, whose brother is Laban. And Laban is going to play a role in the ensuing story. Well, Isaac has a son by the name of, well, he has two, Esau and Jacob. Esau, that crazy Esau, marries a Canaanite woman, marries below his station. But Jacob, of course, Isaac does not want Jacob to marry a Canaanite woman. So he sends him back to, the land of his ancestors. And there, he encounters Laban, and Laban says, yes, you can marry my daughter. And they meet at the well once again. He meets Rachel at the well and asks for Rachel's hand in marriage. To his uncle, Laban. Laban says, sure, you have to work for me 7 years. And you know how the story goes. He works 7 years and his uncle gives him Leah and so he has to work another 7 years, right? But again, the emphasis on going to the well to find a wife. Later on, the story of Moses, after Moses has killed the Egyptian soldier, he runs off to Midian, and there at the well, he saves the daughters of a Midian priest by the name of Jethro. And in so doing, he meets his wife, Zipporah. So it's kind of like a metaphor, right? The well is the place where you go to meet your wife. Well, John is trying to draw on this tradition. He's not trying to give us a little moral story about, Jesus, accepting women of ill repute. He's trying to show that Jesus, as the bridegroom, who's already been introduced as such in chapter 2, now is seeking out the bride. And who is the bride? Well, it's not Israel. It's not the people of Israel. Oh, they can be part of it, right? But it's a woman from the outcast group of Israel known as the Samaritans. And I guess to understand just how important this is, you have to know a little bit about the history of the Samaritans. But let me stop right there, because that's where I'd like to just spend 5 minutes talking about, the history of the divided kingdom and all of these other aspects of Israelite history. Any questions about this so far? I was so delighted when I read this, and I thought, oh, how could I be so silly up until this point? Spong is really teaching me to read, to try as best you can to set aside your assumptions about what this text says, but read symbolically, it is saying something utterly different. Well, how did the Samaritans become the Samaritans? If you read the history of the Israelites, you know that Abraham has a son Isaac, Isaac has a son Jacob, Jacob has 12 sons. Those 12 sons symbolically become the 12 tribes of Israel. Those 12 tribes of Israel come to be enslaved in Egypt. Moses draws them out of Egypt and they establish themselves in the land that originally Abraham was shown by God. And because of, and this would have been the year of about 1022 BCE. That's probably about the time that 1120, geez, now I can't remember. David was king in 1000. So about 200 years prior to this, they moved from Egypt into the land of the Canaanites. And eventually way leads on to way, and David is chosen from the tribe of Judah to become king. Everything's great. David's kingdom flourishes. His son Solomon builds a temple, and of course, David establishes Jerusalem as the capital of his land. These 12 tribes. But then, when Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam shows himself to be very, very undiplomatic, and the nation divides. The 12 tribes divide into two different groups. They are known as the Kingdom of Israel. Now, this map on the left is where the 10 tribes lived, and then 2 tribes remain in the south. Judah and Simeon remain in the south. And the two really, from about 922 to 722, have a very, very tenuous, I don't think it's as hostile as Spong made it out to be, because they were allies when they needed to be allies, but they saw each other as competitors, as you might even call them Cain and Abel in many ways, fighting against each other, who's better. In the north, they created for themselves shrines where they could worship their God, whom they called Elohim. In the south, God was called Yahweh. They established their city in Samaria, their capital city, which was the rival to Jerusalem. And for 200 years, from 922 to 722, these two kingdoms existed side by side until in 722, these 10 kingdoms these 10 tribes in the north were destroyed by the Assyrians. And what happens with the Assyrians when they destroy a territory, they will take people out of that territory and cause them to live in another part of their territory, of the conquered territory, and then they move new people in. So this is what happened in this area now known as Samaria. You have outsiders moving in. And when that happens, you effectively destroy the culture, and the people have no other recourse but to rely upon the overlord, right? Well, Judah in the south was able to hold off that fate for another 150 years or so. But in the north, the 10 tribes of Israel were utterly destroyed, and outsiders moved in to Samaria. And I just want to read in 2 Kings, listen, because all this history takes place in 2 Kings. It's told about. Darn it. Here we go. I'm reading from 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 24 to 34. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon. Now, the Assyrians, they were crazy. They destroyed everything in the whole Fertile Crescent there. They brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria in place of the people of Israel. They took possession of Samaria and settled in its cities. The people took possession of it. When they first settled there, they did not worship the Lord. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. So the king of Assyria was told, the nations that you have carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the laws of the God of the land. Therefore, he sent lions. Okay. And the king of Assyria commanded, Send there one of the priests whom you carried away from there. Let him go and live there and teach them the law of the God of the land. So one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and lived in Bethel. He taught them how they should worship the Lord. But every nation still made gods of its own and put them in the shrines of the high places that the people of Samaria had made. Every nation in the cities in which they lived. The people of Babylon made Succoth Benoth, on and on and on. They made their own gods. So Samaria becomes this weird amalgam, you might say, of you remember there's a Jewish priest there trying to teach them the ways of, I shouldn't call him Jewish, there's an Israelite priest there trying to teach this new immigrant people the ways of God, but these people are continuing to bring their own gods into the land. Okay, now this is going to continue all the way up until the time of Jesus. Actually, what happens is that a hybrid type of what we would call a Judaism evolves as a result of this. It's one part Judaism, one part paganism. And in the time of Jesus, that's what we saw in Samaria. They had different traditions about their ancestors. The people of the northern kingdom tended to focus more on the Jacob traditions. Their father was Jacob and his ancestors and his offspring. The people of the southern kingdom focused on Judah. And so by the time of Jesus, this area known as Judea in the south and then Samaria is a 700-year-old blood feud between the people of Judah and the people of Jacob, you might say. And they don't quite understand each other. They say they worship the same God, but they do it so differently that the people of Judea absolutely hated the Samaritans. So this is the context in which the woman shows up at the well. And the place, I know we only got a few minutes, but I want to just say this part. The place where we get the sense that this woman is a woman of ill repute, that she's an adulterous woman, is where Jesus says to her, hey, go and get your husband. And she says, sir, I have no husband. And he says, yeah, you've had 5 husbands. Well, that has nothing to do with an individual woman at the well who has 5 previous husbands. In fact, that's kind of even hard to imagine, even in our day, right? The 5 husbands she's referring to are the 5 nations that were brought into Samaria in 722. You've got all of these various people, various nations and gods that have produced who you are. And now you're coming for water. Well, I'm telling you that you can take water from this well, but I can offer living water. I can offer the water that binds us all together. And that's the water of the Spirit. This is the water that flowed through creation well before there was a Jacob, and well before there was a Judah, and well before there was a David, and well before there was an Abraham. But the God I am, whose name was revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai, that's the God who brings us all together. And I, Jesus, who stand before you today, am here to offer that God once again. I, Jesus, the bridegroom, who stand before you today, am here to ask for your hand in marriage. That's what this story is about, according to Spong, and by gosh, according to me now, because I completely get it. I think it's great. I've gone over it rather quickly. What comments might you have, if any? Chuck,
Dan, when I first
Yeah, go
read
ahead.
this and hear you talking about it now, I think, how in the world would I expect anybody that I know to preach on Sunday about this in this way? It would just be so far out.
Well, right. I mean, look at the task we have ahead of us. I mean, if we want to, regard this as legitimate, and I do, I've always had this tendency to read these stories very symbolically. But look, our parishioners don't know this history. Well, they're able to see a woman who's had 5 husbands as being a prostitute, right? Or as being, and that's the easy way to go. But that's the Nicodemus way, right? Let's just go with the quick story and then the quick result, or the quick outcome of that story, and what we all should do. You don't sleep around. That's not what we're talking about here. This moralizing that we so quickly do. This is why education, I think, Sharon, is just so important. But you can only lead people so far. As they say, you can lead a horse to living water, but you can't make them drink, right? So, kind of. Any other thoughts? What do you say, Sharon? What would you do? How would you do it?
Well, I like the fact that someone could introduce a different meaning, maybe by understanding, as we have a number of times, the Greek and Hebrew meanings of words,
Right.
or introduce it through in a historical context. In other words, build up to it. Here are things we now understand a little
Right.
better than we used to, kind of build up to it that way.
Yeah.
And then just opening up the possibility for another way to think about this, not because it's something else we thought of earlier was wrong, kind of like
Yeah.
we're doing now, but that it has, now we know more, we understand more, and this adds a possibility to us to have more significance, because the implications of the story, if we understand it this way, are a lot broader and more valuable, I think, and
Sure.
have a deeper meaning. And I think after a certain amount of prep, we could probably get to that. I just don't know. I don't have that kind of courage myself, but.
Well, that's right. But and I think that kind of prep is what we're doing here. But look who we've got. We've got highly educated, mostly retired people who, to try to teach this to the 30-year-olds who are in the church, and they want to come and bring their kids to Sunday school, so they're raised in the same tradition that they were raised in. There's no interest. I'm sorry, there just isn't any interest, and if there is, when they start hearing that this woman at the well isn't supposed to be a real woman, is supposed to be seen symbolically, they're going to turn around and go to the E-Free Church, where they're going to hear what they want to hear.
Well, and I think the possibility of, I'll just call it gentle feminism. I'll just say that, and just play with that word baptism and water that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Open up that kind of context and say, what would happen if we were to understand that the Hebrew people would have naturally considered this to be a part of the birth narrative in this context, and what kind of thought process would be there, and then enter into a little gentler approach to the consideration of women at the well.
Yeah.
Just it's not as strident as saying, okay, now that we've got women, writing about the Bible, then we have to look at everything a different way because they're imposing another context. But instead, the possibility, that a language that we have known all along but not necessarily interpreted in context could offer us a deeper meaning and understanding, kind of thing. I just don't know how far you can ever go with that.
Well, it really does add so much more dimension to the story to see this as a courtship, and not as a kind of a veiled judgment against this woman who is always, in fact, I've actually doing some research on this. I've actually run across some traditions in the Orthodox Church where this woman is referred to as Mary Magdalene. Again, falling back on the, Mary Magdalene as the prostitute and the wife of Jesus kind of tradition. But that's not, she was clearly from Magdala, not Samaria. And so I don't know where that comes from. But just seeing it from, I guess the literal reading or the more traditional reading is at the 100-foot level. And what we're doing is trying to look at it from the 1,000-foot level, as they say, of the much more symbolically, where the lines are a little bit more blurred. So, Chuck, I haven't heard from you, or Constance, or
Up there, got to unmute if I'm going to talk.
yeah,
The thing that that comes through for me goes all the way back to Genesis. God separated the light from the dark. And as we move through all of these different ways of thinking about the stories of the Bible, I keep thinking, here's the light, here's the dark. Choosing the light is not easy.
yeah,
The dark is not fun, but it's a lot more comforting. You can go to sleep and ignore all the garbage.
yeah.
But it's light and dark, light and dark, light and dark keep coming
Especially-
into mind.
Especially when the dark can veil itself as light too. The dark can be easily presented as light.
Yeah,
I don't think we need to come up with any examples of that, but they're abounding. In our recent political, theater. So, any other thoughts? I want to make sure everyone has a chance to speak. Well, our time is upon us, I believe. Yeah, we're about 3 minutes over. So we'll stop our share here. Thank you.
Dan, are you going to be comfortable meeting next Wednesday with the beginning of your semester, or?
I think so. We're just gonna have to, when I work, I don't eat lunch. I just work straight through lunch every day. My only time when I have to myself is 1 hour on Wednesday. And by gosh, if I can't work 1 hour into my schedule just for me, then I need to retire, which I'd like to do, by the way. But if I could do this full time, I would be all over it. But anyway,
I just realized that this is kind of a stormy time, when everybody's checking their schedules and folks,
And-
so.
because I'm not sure what our schedule looks like. Usually I'm gonna have to, can I get back in touch with you on Monday, Sharon, and then you can
Sure.
get it out to everybody else? Because there are some things that I'm just gonna not be able to get out of, let's say like an area wide meeting or something like that. So. but I
Okay,
haven't even
just thought I'd
thought-
check in.
Yeah, thank you. I will let you know. Okay. Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
very much, and Happy
Um,
New Year.
Yes, and we will pick up next time. I guess we're at, I can't remember what chapter we're on. I guess on chapter 11. We'll start looking ahead. So, Al, good to see you. Glad you got some nice warm weather out there. So, Constance, thanks for Christmas dinner. Appreciated that, everybody. See you all later.
all right. Happy New Year.
Yeah, you too. Bye.